My name is Rob Core. I've been a web developer for probably a little bit over maybe 20 years now. Worked for Cisco, Intel, a bunch of different companies, pretty much every tech stack around as far as JavaScript stacks. I'm going to present a little bit about Storybook and also how to create layers to your components in React and how to integrate those components with Storybook to kind of separate out logic and view. Um, so, so to go a little bit into it, Storybook, what it is it's a way to basically take a component, such as a button like this, and make it so you can see it in isolation outside of your app, and then be able to see it in various different views, and those views, which are called stories, are basically a collection of attributes that are passed into that component. So this way you can see, okay, well, what happens when we pass in small, medium, or large to it, and how that affects the actual button itself. So we can choose whether this is a primary button or a secondary button, and so on. So Storybook, in essence, is just a way of creating, in essence, a menu um, of your components that you can kind of choose from and be able to use. And it's nice because it gives designers a direct view into what the component is going to be looking like before it's actually even placed in the site. There's also lots of integrations, especially Figma recently has a Figma, I think it's called Figma Code, which actually allows you to integrate Storybook into it as well. So this way you can have an interface between a Figma design and Storybook component, and basically they can feed into each other. Um, so we're going to build a fancy little shop today, which is basically going to sell some soap, some shampoo, and some toothbrushes, and each of these are going to be a component. So if we go into the actual code base, we have a we have our main app. It has a list of products. So product list, what it does is it pulls from a products.json. So it's kind of a stand-in for an API, which is just basically it's going to be a static JSON file. And in that products, it sets a variable, and then it iterates through them and shows each of these products. So a product looks like this. It has name, description, all that, which you just saw. It also has a button which allows you to update the count in the cart. So you can see here, we have all these things, and this is all coming from that JSON, and it's being loaded in here, and you can see it adds to the cart. In this example, I'm using a use context here. This could easily be, use Redux. It could be a Redux thing. It could be any sort of state management that you might use. But for this example, we're using use context. And a quick look at that, what it is in the app.js here, we have this shopping cart context provider. In our context folder, we have a wrapper that basically passes down that value. We have a context, it has counts, and it has a dispatcher. We're using a shopping cart reducer, which basically has an add and remove actions to it. So this could have been implemented in a dozen different ways. But the important points are that this product is pulling in this, and it's using a handle add to cart, which actually calls the dispatcher. It's fetching it from the context, and products is also making an API call. Um, and these are all things that are extremely common in most React code bases. And it also is one of the major problems with one, trying to integrate with Storybook, but two, in this example, it's extremely simplified, but it can create very large components that have a lot of complexity in them, and create a lot of debugging issues later. So uh, we're going to move to basically having a container type model where basically this logic is pulled out, the product and the products become simply simply representational, for simply for rendering. So to do that, so let's say we have a large legacy application. We want to be able to move away from this, but let's say product is used all throughout our site, and we can't quite move everything over to product container instantly. So one thing we can do is something along these lines where we can take it and go dot deprecated, and then we can say 2023-07. This is a common way that I like to do it, and then basically if you're using Visual Studio Code or anything that goes and updates all the dependencies, basically everything that relies on that will now point to this newly renamed file, and then we can actually create a new product component like this. So new file, and we're going to, hold on one second. So we're going to move, so this was already existing in the previous one here above. We have the product data. I'm using TypeScript here. This can also be done using prop types and various other things, but I find TypeScript to be pretty good, and it actually works out well because I think prop types as well as TypeScript, Storybook can actually read these parameters and actually understand what props are actually going into a product. So, but if we look here, a second. Oh, yes. No, there we go. All right, now it works better. Okay, so if you see, we actually have removed the handle add to cart, and we actually are going to be passing that in. We're also passing down the cart counter. So now, if we were to take this loaded into Storybook, we don't need to create all those shells around this product. We can actually pass in value. We can actually pass in a function, and we can actually pass in a number. Um, so it creates a nice starting point for wrapping it and putting it elsewhere. These values are not currently passed in from the products list. We're not going to do the whole creating a deprecated version of products, but if it was a product that if this was a thing that we were actually working on, we probably create also a deprecated version, especially if it's something that's used across the code base. Here, we're just going to say this is only used here, so we don't need to create a deprecated version. Um, so things that we're going to do here is we're going to get rid of this products API here. We're going to move that out to a container as well. Um, so we then are just reduced down to basically receiving this from the container and then outputting the products. So extremely simplified. And we can see here, this is what this products actually takes in. So this brings us to this container. Now, the container itself is where all that logic has moved up into. So basically, we have a state for basically recording our products here. We're actually moving this function up to for handling adding to cart. We're going to pass these down to the child components, um, and we're going to use the use context here, which of course would be also for doing Redux or whatever. Um, so let's see. So if we do this, let's see if it still works. Products is undefined. Let's see. Oh, all right. Well, now products is a different signature. It doesn't actually take in no properties. It actually takes in properties. And in our main app here, we need to actually call in the product container instead. There we go. All right. So now, same exact functionality, but we've moved everything out. So the product and the products list are then basically just real simple components. Now this makes it so we can actually create a storybook component for a product easily. So, um, so as we were showing you earlier with the buttons, a button could be looks like this in Storybook. Uh, so it can take a bunch of arguments, and those arguments basically override what the defaults are. You can also do something, and I find this way more useful for building components that actually take in some sort of functionality like clickable elements. You can create a story that is a function. So here I have a one called basic product. It has some default values, but it takes in the story arguments, and then it maintains its own state of a cart. So instead of having the use context that I had, I'm just having use state inside this one story here, and I'm passing that in, and that's a replacement for handle add to cart. Um, so this is kind of the nice way of basically taking something that would have a large amount of overhead logic for your state management and just simplifying it down for an individual story. Um, and it takes in a initial cart count state as well. So basically, I can set those properties in Storybook. When we come back to Storybook, well, a second, we can see we have a new section here called Shop. If you take a look in the code base, um, stories have a title. It starts with basically your top heading, and then it has, in essence, your actual component name. So it's a way of organizing your stories, and then each of these is an individual story. So it gives us a nice little example of it based upon the default values. We can go over to here. Oh, so the docs for it, if you take a look, we have name. That's the only archetype that we actually specify here, but we can do things like we can say price, and we can say control, it's a number. We can also do something like description, and it'll give you a little bit of that. Another nice thing about using TypeScript is that it seems that GitHub Copilot really picks up on the type information, is able to pass that along and give the AI useful hints for actually being able to display this sort of information. So if we go down to the basic product, we can say um, toothbrush. We can set the price to be something. We can set description equal to toothbrush. Now, one of the things that we didn't do is we didn't include a bunch of other things. So let's say is on sale. That's something that basically is going to control the style of this element and also add some extra details to it. So I can set the Boolean for it and I can make it a true. This basically adjusts the classes that are used in this component. Now, um, now I basically did something where I was just using SCSS. I'm a strong believer that, basically you want to tie your styles to your individual component. I like SCSS because, basically I like to use classes still instead of having dynamic class names, but there's a lot of different ways that you can handle styling in React. And all of them work very well with Storybook. And in essence, when we go to the product page here, we can see that the is on sale value basically determines which class this winds up being in. Um, I think it does. I mean, in essence, creating a test case for something as simple as the product would be, practically trivial. And creating a test case for the container itself also becomes more focused on the logic part of it. Because when I think of containers, I think of things that don't do anything as far as rendering out, doing anything with the rendering of the data, just simply the processing of the data. so this makes it so you can have your test cases focused on what it is that this thing is supposed to do. So, for instance, I would make this so it would be like, oh, I pass in these values. If I pass in on sale, I would expect the on sale element to appear, and I expect some styling to happen, which is an extremely simple test. Um, and then on the product level component, I would possibly do something where I'd say pass in a detailed structure of products, and I'd expect some of them to be on sale, and I'd expect basically the same for it. So, I mean, basically, I think it separates out the different parts of the product a little bit more clearly. Because I know when I've dealt with, a single type of component that has like 500 lines of code in it because it's got all these logic where it's pulling in so much data and then it's doing the rendering and everything like that. And there's a bunch of different parts to the rendering process. It winds up being that the tests are much more elaborate. And with this, you can make it so your tests are individual and more focused. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, a product, if you pass in some parameters in it, you can use a snapshot for it and then be considered done. Where, if it was something that was more combined, I would look at a snapshot test case as not really a true test case because snapshots they don't really do a good job of capturing what happens with logic, and it's kind of a lazy way of creating a test case where if it's just purely a style component, a snapshot works great, and then this product one would focus all on the logic. The container would focus more on the logic, I meant. Hey, um for for this one, not using any style library. I've used a bunch of them in the past. I really still fall back on the old SCSS because it renders extremely fast. And I know that basically the pollution of CSS is a major problem, where basically if you have components, they could overwrite each other. But my method is usually to have something like either the the component name, or I do something like component dash product, and then the CSS would be. And then this makes it so you never have those clashes. And what I always love is when you go into your browser debug tools, you can go and find this class. You can actually modify this class's CSS right into the browser and see your changes. Where if you do something like anything that uses JavaScript to actually edit styles and stuff, sometimes you'll wind up where it will keep reverting the changes, and also then it becomes a little bit more tricky sometimes to add styling to pages. I also use extensions that basically can overwrite styles so I can actually see them in the browser without editing in the code. So let's say if I'm testing on the live site or something like that. So I mean, I don't know. I'd say it's a little bit old school, but I love having actual name classes that match up rather than, in essence, a random series of letters and numbers being the class names. Uh, so I'm just going to do a little bit. A second. Uh, one of the things that I find, I'm working with a different company that uses something called Kendo for Angular, and we run into the problem where Kendo is kind of outdated, and we have it throughout our code base. It's a major transition thing that we need to actually do, and I'm actually using Storybook to try and help them get to that point. Um, so this way we can switch over to some other frameworks. Basically, I always assume that any UI framework it has a shelf life of at maximum 3 to 5 years. So, Material UI is excellent now. It'll be probably something different in the future. So, what I always like to do is create my own component library and have it be wrappers for some sort of component. So, let's say you have your I can't quite remember. Well, here, it should be something like this. Let's say that's how you do a Material UI button in Material UI. I forget exactly what it is, but that's all right. And then you could have something like label, um, and then you can basically pass in that label to it. And what this means is basically if you do this for every single component that you decide to use in your library that is from Material UI, one day when you're like, oh, okay, well, we want to change how all the buttons work, it's easy to change it in this individual component. And it makes it so it's quicker to update the code base. You can easily say, oh, well, I want to change, and it doesn't even need to be a change of Material UI to something else. I want to change that all the buttons now use a different property to make it styled differently. Or we can actually throw in some styling that can actually be passed down to Material UI from here. Um, what it's best to do, at least as far as I've seen, especially on very large projects, is to have your components be your own and the libraries that you use be the things that those components call. So then I can be like, oh, well, whenever we have a button, we want to have it to be large, you know. And this way, then that's an easy change right here. We can actually throw in our styling into this part here. Um, so that's one of the things that I try and do whenever we include major frameworks like this. Oh, mm, mm. And this is a common thing, which is like and again, it still means that, creating a reliance. Like, so let's say you have these 20 or 30 different apps that are using Material UI buttons. If let's say the organization is moving away from Material UI or making a style change to them all, that's a lot of apps to update and a lot of apps that probably sometimes people aren't even working on anymore. Um, so this is where basically building an NPM package related to just basically a style library itself is ideal. And having that with Storybook built into it is really great because basically then you can have a component library that can be imported into all of your projects. You can import those components yourself, and then you have a single source of truth of what exactly a button is supposed to be, and that can change. And then basically all the other packages can, I mean, all the other apps can update that package, and then be able to see the new styling. Um, so, so yeah, I would basically, if you have a lot of apps, whenever you get to a point where you have, several apps that are using the same components, um, I would basically have it so you have a design system package. Um, and basically you call it something like reusable components or something like that, and then everywhere basically uses that. But still, it should always be something that the organization owns as far as these top level components. And then underneath that and how it works is and it could just simply be a wrapper. Wrappers are totally acceptable, but this makes it so you're not dependent upon some external library. If you take a look, when we go into that product story here, um, I wrote a single function, and that single function, in essence, outputs the product. So it doesn't really have a whole lot going on in it. This is all just default values that are being passed down to the props. It gives a description, and it allows you to basically have that showcase of this component, but it also throws in um, basically being able to tweak that live to be whatever you want it to be. So you can see like, okay, well, so programmer, you've created a component and we had these requirements for this component. It needs to be able to have it so when it's on sale, it becomes a certain color, um, which is now broken for some reason, but it was just working just a moment ago. Um, Basically, the story needs to go back to some modifying, but basically, it allows you to basically have that showcase. Um, Now there is some integrations that they do have for book that allow you to basically let's see. Yeah, so it allows for prototyping, testing, documentation. Uh, and basically you can view your storybook elements in Figma, and you can also view your Figma elements in VS Code and actually be able to see them side by side. So I haven't played enough with the actual plugin to actually give a detailed explanation of it, but it does allow basically designers and developers to kind of go back and forth with being able to see things. So I know for a demo that I've recently seen, basically it created a sub panel kind of the same way that Copilot has a panel over here. It actually shows a panel which basically allows you to see the Figma styles and see the actual like rendering of the application piece in Figma, and allows you to basically write up the code for it. It's not really a storybook integration per se, but then from Figma you can actually see the storybook element in it. I wish I could actually be a little bit more concrete on this because I haven't actually worked on it at all yet. So this is something I'm going to start exploring myself because it's a brand new feature for Figma. Mhm. Yeah, so this actually ties in real well to something that was mentioned earlier. I'm sorry, I forget which person it was that said it, but basically, when you have 20 applications and you're trying to actually use a component across all of them and you're trying to do something like that, I've created a design system based upon that, basically a reusable package, because we had the same exact problem in a former project. Um, and this was fantastic because basically, before we even got into the actual building of the application that we wanted to build, we had a designer design all of the components for it, and I was able to write all the actual components in React, put them into Storybook, and then she was able to be like, okay, I could go and see my drop down input when it has an error on it, with this content as the selection options, and so on and so forth, and basically be able to review each of these components and check them off the list as far as, okay, well, these have been designed correctly, and now we can actually start using them into the site. Um, so I think that's one of the best things is when a designer wants to have an individual component built, that will be used in the site, they can verify it before we even start wrapping logic around it, um, which is a major step forward because typically the design and the styling and the coding and the logic are all being built in the same point in like a Jira story. Um, and this allows you to break down that story into separate pieces, be like, okay, make the component. All right, how much effort is that? And then after that, okay, now we're gonna take that component and pass in the logic for it. How much is it to get the logic and add that to it? So what's nice is you can take like, let's say an 8 or 13 point story and you can be like, oh, okay, well I can easily shave off 2 of those points and put that into an individual thing that can then be merged in and we can know already looks right. And then we can move on to the next story, which is actually placing that into the site and actually receiving the logic for it. So it's great for a number of different, pragmatic reasons, I would say. And 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 this is another thing which is real nice because so you were mentioning like, designers they don't want to, get too much into the code complexity and all this. But the difference between a programmer and a designer kind of winds up being kind of a little bit of a spectrum in a way. So there are some people that are pure designers that they can dabble some in some JavaScript code and not panic. And what's nice about creating components like this product here, where there is practically no logic, is if I gave this to a designer who can do HTML, they can see this, they can be like, oh, okay, they can understand and actually be able to modify this, they can modify the CSS, they can handle and own all of this, create their own PR and actually submit this in. So let's say you have somebody that is a fresh graduate, they they don't have a deep understanding of good principles for engineering yet, but they can code and they also know enough about CSS and HTML, to not cause too much damage to themselves. So you can basically take a junior developer, put them on making these products, put them on making these smaller components, get them to be able to see them in Storybook, have an instant feedback loop of, okay, I've built this, it looks right, here it is, we can verify this, we can mark this story as done. And then let's say somebody that's a more senior engineer can then go work on the product's container. Um, this is good because basically, it's hard to get senior engineers into an organization. And there's plenty of people that are kind of dabbling in JavaScript that really can't take on some of the more advanced things that need to be done. Because, let's face it, basically web application development has ramped up as far as complexity over the last decade. And so what used to be very simple is now much more elaborate as far as how much you have to know before you can even hit the ground. So this creates a nice stepping stone where you can basically hire somebody that is kind of fresh, but you know what? Anyone can be able to write something that would actually be able to create this. Um, and what's nice is that you can take somebody that is a designer now, you can have them start working on this, and then they can start branching out into further pieces of the code base and learning and growing as an individual, and actually wind up being a good contributor for many years beyond. So I look at Storybook as sort of like it provides a lot of practical um, results for an organization beyond just basically being a showcase of components. It kind of shoves you in a direction to create a separation of logic, which gives you a lot of benefits. Well, for people that work in the back end, depending upon what the back end means, if it's JavaScript, that's one thing. If it's Java, in essence, they already, in essence, have dealt with, in essence, their version of TypeScript because they have a strongly typed language. Um, so one of the things that I find is, so let's say, so this product data here, we have we have these properties here. For one, okay, let's take a step back and say, is TypeScript really hard to implement? This is how I usually implement components. I get a product's properties here, it goes into here, and basically it's the same as prop types. I'm not sure if you're using prop types heavily in your React application, but it makes it nice because basically you don't have to come into this file to actually find out what it needs. Um, so if I wanted to, let's go up to this app. Where's the apps? Let's see. So I can easily see right here, like, okay, oh, that's because I don't actually have it imported. A second. Ah, nope. There we go. All right, there we go. Now it's actually imported. All right. Um, so what this does is it immediately tells me what it needs to actually have in it, which is the products, the handle of cart, and cart counts. It's nice and all. It's what people usually tout as far as one of the things that are nice about TypeScript is you can see, okay, well, here are some of the things that I need to put in here. and that is really nice because also I find that working TypeScript, Google Copilot really is able to give suggestions that are much more on point than if you don't have typing at all in your file. I've seen basically it winds up hallucinating a lot more when you're trying to do such things. But the important point is, let's say if I decide to change this here, let's say that, let's see, a product needs color. Here, we'll put it in here. Color needs to be a string. All right. So now, and then we can take this here. We can say color, and let's just say, um, oh, we'll just say color equals color. This will make no sense whatsoever here, but that's all right. I just don't want to have an unused variable. So now this is a required field of product data. Um, and I think the problem is that I'm working with an API here, so it's not quite throwing me an error here. Uh, oh, here we go. So it's interesting. It's not showing up as red on this, but usually the files actually become red. It might be because I have some sort of different configuration on this repo. But basically, now I can see instantly that this is a problem that needs to be resolved. Um, and more importantly, down here, the actual code base products and paint container. This says Keller is missing on this import. So let's say if I've changed product and I needed to be able to have a Keller for all of the things that is passed into it, I can now make it so everything will throw an error that does not have that. And what's nice is, and this is going to be in the actual like dev view of things. So when you're actually running it in TypeScript, it's going to throw TypeScript errors, not the compiled JavaScript code that comes out. So this is going to show to me that, oh, you need to go update your code and actually fix this. Um, and I've had it where, there's code bases that have well over 1,000 files. I make a single code change to a component that everything works on with, and let's say it comes up with, let's say, 40 or 50 different places in the code base that now are throwing errors. I go through them and it's just like a little punch list, and I can go through and add and change every single one of those to be able to fit the new components requirements. And I would not be able to do that easily without TypeScript. It basically allows me to make changes rapidly to things that lots of things are dependent upon, and I can easily identify where those changes are and be able to fix them. Um, and then this goes a little bit further where basically if you have a package that you're importing, let's say a design components package, you can easily say it will tell you when you need to actually provide certain values into that component that it would take a bit of digging to actually identify if you had to go into the actual thing. It's also caught me on a lot of different things where it's just like, oh, well, I was taking something in as this object type that has these values here. Somewhere in the actual component as I'm writing it, um, I refer to a property in a way that's not a string, it's a number instead. Well, those are very tricky things to debug, and basically TypeScript does a good job of basically yelling at you when you're doing the wrong thing with a type. Um, One of the problems with TypeScript is sometimes you spend a little bit more time coding to try to fix TypeScript errors. That's the biggest hurdle as far as a new TypeScript developer. Um, and Usually you get past it after a little while because you start to identify like, okay, these are the things I need to do. And it's like a learning process that happens over a month or two where you're like, okay, this is how you handle TypeScript errors. I find Google Copilot extremely good at basically writing TypeScript because TypeScript just follows patterns. And uh, AI is really good at identifying patterns, repeating patterns, and fixing patterns. So they actually seem to go really nicely hand in hand, TypeScript and Copilot. And when you think about it, AI is really just basically the dumbest developer that you can kind of bring along with you that likes to do lots of work. So it makes sense that TypeScript works out well with it. So, so yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think they chose a really great name when they said Copilot because you'd never want to give it the steering wheel, because I mean, like just watching it, like when I go, okay, let's do product. It does nice little completions. Like, oh, all right, well, that was fine. But it also gives a little bit more. So let's say if I had, let's go and grab, where's it at? Oh yeah, product. Let's say I do this and go back up to the app, and let's say I say, whoops, don't do that. Uh, Constant products, and I just do this. Or actually, you know what? Let's just do product and then close it off. And you can see it's giving like kind of the grayed out text all the time everywhere I'm going as far as suggestions. And all I have to do is press tab to kind of accept them in. If I do something like this, it all of a sudden goes, oh, you probably want to take that product and stick it in there. And of course, it did an idiotic thing and it's trying to pass products into. Actually, no, it's not. It should actually pass it in as an array. Am I doing something wrong here? Do, do, do. Whatever. We don't need to get too deep into it. But basically, it does suggestions, and sometimes it gives me interesting suggestions that I don't think about while I'm coding. But it likes to hallucinate a lot, and TypeScript seems to make it hallucinate less because basically, if you don't give it information, it just makes up information. Um, that's the typical thing with these large learning models is it just likes to make up things that it doesn't know. But if you give it lots of stuff to know, it can actually put things together in surprisingly good ways. Like um, like this JSON file that I wrote. I called it products. I started typing, and it came up with name, price. It gave a example price. It it gave a suggestion of description. It typed in this whole nonsense here of what soap is. I didn't write any of this stuff. This all just came from TypeScript. I did an image. It suggested a unsplash image that didn't actually exist, but I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll use unsplash in this, and I went and found one that worked. So it's just like, oh, hey, how about you do this? And I was like, nah, you're being stupid. But then sometimes it's like, all right, well, you're just kind of filling it all in for me, and that's nice. So it takes care of brain dead tasks real well. Um, yeah. Oh, so sorry. I don't actually see the hands right now. I think, yeah, yeah. Go ahead, Steve. No worries. Um, I wouldn't say at all. Like, so part of this was I was actually planning on making products itself be a story as well. Um, and I don't see any problem with it. Basically, um, the thing that needs to be done is when you're making a story, you need to get anything that basically relies on the external application stuff, like your Redux, your state, and all this, and have it pulled out so it's only handling what's being passed in props. I'm sure there's ways beyond this that you can do in Storybook to actually wrap these components automatically with, your initial state and stuff, and that could be useful, especially if you want to have, let's say, logged in users and stuff. Um, but I prefer to basically make it so Storybook is forcing me to a design ethos that actually works out really well. Um, but no, I don't really see that there is a thing that I would be perfectly happy to do an entire page in a storybook because basically, it handles things very well, and I wouldn't see a size limit. Yep, yep, and uh, and when you do that, you do need to do some thought process. So if you saw during this little demo one of the things that I did that was a poor choice as far as React development goes here is this product container here. It's passing products down. It's also passing handle add to cart. Um, and and this cart counts dispatch is the updater for it. So this could cause a lot of re-rendering. So some things that I might do is I might pass this function down into let's say the products list here, and then I'd create inside of this loop here, I'd create maybe a callback here that would get passed down to product. This way, you don't have to deal with re-rendering of the entire product tree. You'd be re-rendering individual products, let's say if an individual count changes for an individual value. Um, it's it's one of those things where basically you need to think about that as a developer is like, okay, well, what happens when we have a list of 500 elements and two of them change? Do we have to re-render all 500 elements? So that's some of the things is basically making sure that you can pinpoint stuff. Another thing that can be done is this whole handle to cart thing. We could actually move that all out of product container and products and move it into the product here. Oh, not there, there. We can move it down into here and actually use context in this here. And then what we can do is, let's say in the story itself, we could say, okay, this here, we actually use the actual was it product shopping cart context. We could do something like this and stick this in here, so this way it can get the context for that. I tried to avoid because I didn't want to do it too much into this because that actually would have created a little bit more complexity as far as thought for this presentation. Um, but it is something to consider because this will make it so um, we can have our context be able to, short circuit through React, skip all the layers of the parents of product, and update that individual product to prevent re-rendering of all of them. Uh, this kind of gets into the advanced like React stuff where basically you're handling things that are slowing down the site. Um, I um, this context, yeah, I wouldn't give it a story. No, I would just basically make this. Oh yeah, I would create a separate story for it. I could make it so that this is called products story, and then there's a product and a products. Uh, so products stories could contain product and products. It's really just how you want to basically organize and categorize things. Um, but or you could just basically make it so this is product, and you can have a separate set of stories that are products. But this do larger stories import smaller stories? Not really, no. Let me see here. So you can see here, product is the name of this file here. So we have our top level title here, product. This actually isn't even the component. This is really just, in essence, a category for this set of stories. And these are the individual stories. So if you want to, you could have products. You could have instead of this, you could be like um, basic product. And then we could have, or we could have it, as product story, which try and avoid clashes in names. You can have product story like this. See if it just deals with it. No, a second. This is causing problems because it's not in there. Well, in either case, but basically, oh yeah, see, that's nice. Even though there's an error, it's still rendering out the tree nicely. Um, So basically, yeah, I would try to couple things together that are similar, create individual functions that. So if you take a look at this button one, this is all working with the same exact component. It's just giving different contexts for what they are in. Like this is a warning button. And in essence, these ones just basically change the attributes. So, but yeah, I would totally create a separate story for products and then basically maybe have it so, okay, well, let's say if you have products that are cars and you have products that are, soaps, you might have the soaps products or and the cars products, and they could be both using the same component, but since they are receiving different sets of property values, they could be rendering differently. So you might want to see them that way. So in essence, Storybook is really a way of showcasing the different ways that components can be seen. Mhm, mhm. Um, huh. I think basically when it comes to QAing for Storybook elements, it usually comes back around to the designer to do the QAing. So basically, the person who is looking at something to be perfect and working correctly, but not so much functionally part of the site, is the one that's going to be testing it, and that's going to be the person who originally did the Figma designs. At least that's what my experience mostly has been as far as Storybook and actually basically moving a Jira story over the to the done line is basically having the actual designers be the QA testers for it. um, hmm. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, but it won't make a lot of sense for, a number of things, such as, actual reusable components that are going to be used across the app, which is going to be a lot of what is going to exist in Storybook. But if you're doing Storybook, let's say for a component that exists only on an individual page, you might have a story for the page itself if you want to do that. But you'd probably have the page as a top level here, and then basically have the actual components that are going to be in that page and all the different ways they might be rendered underneath that page heading. So that's kind of how I would do it is to try and group things together as far as what they are. But for stuff like, let's say, form elements, you probably are going to have one thing for one top level that's called forms. And you might have one that's, UI elements and stuff like that. So, I mean, this is gets into the programming thing, which is one of the two most difficult things in programming is, off by one errors and naming things. So yeah, it depends a lot on basically the structure of your app.
Hey all, sorry to cut it off so abruptly there. Basically, it started to devolve into a bunch of individual conversations. But I hope you all learned a bunch for how to structure React in Storybook and how to use them all together. If you have any questions or if you'd like me to do another video to cover other subjects relating to web development, relating to Angular, React, Node.js, MongoDB, feel free to drop a line in the comments and I'll make something special just for you guys. All right, have a good one.